Hi, it's Rob Herman, and welcome to the SuperPerformers podcast powered by 4100 FS. As we worked on developing this podcast, our overriding goal was to create a compelling platform for accessible insights on work and life from successful, driven, and highly accomplished leaders. Leaders with unique experiences across a wide variety of fields, including business, medicine, law, sports, entertainment, education, and philanthropy, among others. In my head, I started to work through a fascinating group I wanted as guests, and I got pretty excited. I've gotten to know these people through my own varied experiences early in my career on Capitol Hill, later working on Wall Street and as an investment manager, being an entrepreneur, and now leading a unique and thriving company called 4100 FS while also focusing on community engagement. I think you'll really enjoy hearing the stories of these guests, learning about their respective paths, finding out what motivates them and how they define success. Glad to have you with us on the SuperPerformers podcast. Without further ado, on to our guest today. Excited to have today on the SuperPerformers podcast, Dr. Jordan Bonomo. Now, usually we read through a bio that's provided to us, get through it and start the conversation. If we did that here, Jordan, with you, it would take the entire podcast episode. So let me give some highlights. But first of all, welcome to the program. We've been talking about this for a long time, so it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Rob. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So Jordan, you're a neurointensivist for the University of Cincinnati Gardner Neuroscience Institute. Since 2009, you're also a cardiothoracic and ECMO intensivist. ECMO is cardiac and respiratory failure related. You're a director of the Division of Critical Care in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. You're the director of the Neurocritical Care Fellowship. You provide leadership for the organ donor management at Life Center Organ Donor Network in Cincinnati, directing all aspects of organ donor management prior to donation. You were previously a flight physician for the University of Cincinnati Medical Center Air Care and a tactical physician for the Cincinnati Police SWAT team for many years. Some great stories behind that. Your research focuses on the management of acute traumatic brain injury, optimization of organ donation, resuscitation, and the broader topic of critical care ethics. You're a professor of clinical neurosurgery and neurocritical care. You have some pretty impressive peer-reviewed publications. One example, the incidence of non-convulsive seizures in patients undergoing therapeutic hypothermia after resuscitation from cardiac arrest. Many more examples of really compelling research you've done. You've been named as one of the top doctors in Cincinnati every year since 2011. You're a veteran of numerous international medical missions, including in Haiti after the great earthquake in 2010. We'll be talking more about that. You're the driving force behind the development of the new University of Cincinnati Medical Center Flex ICU. I show video of you cutting the ribbon right in front of me. It's the first inpatient facility of its kind, and I'm looking forward to conversation around the strategy and implementation of this new Flex ICU. You're working on a medical AI startup focused on preventative care. And based on all the above, you have plenty of free time, so why not? You're now the co-owner of CrossFit Cincinnati, one of the original 500 CrossFit affiliates in the world. You have an amazing wife and two great boys. Your wife is a physician as well. Let's get started.
By the way, thanks for that really kind introduction.
The facts are the facts.
I didn't choose to be a physician. I don't ever remember that. I just know that from the time I was tiny and I could give voice to it, that's all I ever wanted to do. I knew that being a physician was where my heart and soul were. So you could have asked me when I was 3 or 4 or 7, it wouldn't have mattered. It would have been the same answer, that I was going to be a doctor one day. I didn't even know what it meant, right? I had my pediatrician and Dr. DePaula was an amazing old Italian guy. I loved him. But he certainly wasn't the only influence. I've thought quite a bit about where that journey started. And the truth is my father was a World War II veteran. He's a little bit older than some other dads. He had me when he was in his 50s. But he was a corpsman in the war. And I remember thinking quite a bit about what that was like for him. And he had intended to become a physician. And as with many of those veterans, the war changed life and he came home and had a different path. But I think that was probably embedded somewhere deep in my psyche from the time I was very little, that taking care of other people was what I wanted to do.
Yeah, well, that's pretty compelling with that family background and your dad. Does that kind of relate to how your choice of specialty evolved in terms of what you do? Because you're constantly in high pressure, high risk pretty intense situations.
Well, the truth of the matter is if you journey through any emergency department in America, you're going to find a bunch of physicians with pretty impressive attention deficit disorder. It draws us to the specialty. And I, like many of us, have that gift. I have the ability to hyper focus during high stress situations. And when there's not quite enough adrenaline, I kind of go to sleep a little bit. So emergency medicine was a good fit. I actually started out as a firefighter and EMT when I was 16 back in Virginia. I got to join a volunteer fire department while I was in high school. So I would run rescue at night and then go to school during the day. And that's where I really found my passion for the emergency side of things, the cutting edge of it. We had a swiftwater rescue team, and I got to do some of that stuff out at Great Falls Park in DC, which is just pretty amazing to, hang off of ropes and try to get people who are stuck in the whitewater out. And I learned pretty early that level of adrenaline was really what I sought. And in emergency medicine, it's certainly there. But the other thing with emergency medicine is that you're useful anywhere, right? So you're on an airplane and the bell goes off and they say, is there someone who can help? There's a medical emergency. There are not a lot of us who are able to actually raise our hands confidently and say, sure, I can. Your pediatric neurosurgeon is great with a subspecialty population, but they may not be super comfortable, traipsing around the aircraft, seeing what they can rustle up to help out. So I decided I always wanted to be helpful. And then, emergency medicine became critical care pretty quickly for me. I loved emergency medicine. I love the ED. I love the field environment too, being out on the helicopter and the tactical stuff. But I really gravitated towards the sickest of the sick. And, the intensive care unit being a continuation of what we do in the emergency department really drew me.
Great. And I want to come back to talking a little bit more about the new Flex ICU. It's
Sure.
great background and story, but let's talk also about your fantastic wife, Andrea Rinderneck. You met her in undergrad.
Yeah.
Also an accomplished physician. And it's interesting when you met, I don't know if her career track was in mind too, but it is interesting to think about, just to kind of give listeners context. Dre is an incredibly strong person, also somewhat personality wise, complementary to you in terms of being, I think, a little more of an introvert, and has when she talks, people really listen. But it is interesting. Talk a little bit about how you met, whether you both were on that same track from early on, and how your personalities kind of mesh.
Well, she was born in Switzerland. She was born in Zurich and then raised in San Francisco. Her father did a PhD postdoc fellowship, so postdoctorate fellowship at Stanford, and then stayed on at Genentech, the large biotech firm in the Bay Area. So she grew up around science and realized that science and bioscience in particular were really what caught her interest. And she and I were in the same program at Brown. Brown has this really neat 8-year medical program where if you can get into it, you actually get into college and medical school the same day. So you're admitted to undergrad and medical school, and they eliminate some of the hurdles, at least they did back when we were there. So you didn't have to take the MCAT. You could major in something other than a science. And it was a really attractive program for people who had a strong interest in medicine, but a strong interest in humanities as well. And Andre and I actually matriculated into that program together. So in the sea of 5,000 undergrads, there were 60 of us in this program or so, and I met her at our orientation picnic. Interestingly, she doesn't remember meeting me. So she thinks that we met in math class 2 weeks later. We didn't, but it's okay. 30 years later, we've agreed to disagree on when our anniversary of meeting actually is. But she was a bioscience major, and then she majored in comparative literature at the same time. She speaks 4 or 5 languages reasonably fluently. She'll tell you she only speaks 3. It's not true. And yeah, she's really strong, right? So she's a pretty impressive athlete. And interestingly, we really influenced each other throughout our time growing up. We both, I was a rock climber and whitewater kayaker, got her into it. We did that as our 2 primary sports. And then we got into ice climbing together, and then we got into jujitsu together. And then we got into CrossFit together, and she's a much better athlete than I am, frankly. And she also did a pediatrics residency here in Cincinnati, and then went on to do pediatric emergency medicine. So again, this sort of complementary career, we could understand what each other did. She is now in private practice doing general pediatrics, and I have stayed the academic course.
Yeah. Well, she's an incredible pediatrician. So just to heap a little more praise on Andrea, a lot of respect for how good she is, and also seeing the two of you together is a pleasure, and how you kind of work together in life, and even talking shop sometimes. So let's talk a little bit about, because for a lot of lay people like me, that are vaguely familiar with the types of situations you're in, day out, and we're friends. So I hear on occasion, watered down stories without too much detail. But talk to me about what your life is like, and maybe we'll get into the new Flex ICU a little bit later. But up to this point in recent years, what's your day to day like? What are you doing? What kinds of situations do you find yourself in? What is that actually like to be Jordan Bonomo on a day to day basis at work?
A lot of days I show up and I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm pretty beholden to my calendar and my administrative assistants who are able to keep me on track. Not to mention my wife who sends me in the right direction most mornings. Um, the truth is, my job is a mix. It's a mix of emergency medicine and critical care. And for a lot of people, the difference isn't very clear. Emergency medicine is what happens in an ER. The undifferentiated patients, they can show up anytime. You never know what it's going to be. It's a precipitous delivery, it's a gunshot wound, it's septic shock, it's a heart attack, it's a stroke, right? All of those things. We're a level 1 trauma center here in Cincinnati, where I spend all of my time clinically. So we see the worst of the worst for trauma also. So any major traumatic injury in the region needs to come to us. So we get the patients from the gunshot wounds and the penetrating trauma, but also the bad car accidents and the structure fires and the building collapses and all that stuff. So that's what I do when I'm in the emergency department is I see those patients. But once those patients survive their initial ER care and they require ongoing intensive care, they get put into an intensive care unit. The institution where I'm located, we are lucky enough to have about 140 ICU beds, and they're divided amongst specialties. So we have specific beds for neurocritical care, for cardiac critical care, trauma and surgical critical care, medical and pulmonary critical care. We have a neonatal ICU too, which I don't work in. I don't really take care of kids outside the ER. And then we have this new Flex ICU, which we built recently for sort of all comers. So I spend my time in the neuro ICU, taking care of neurologically injured patients. I'm board certified in neurocritical care. I was lucky enough to train here in Cincinnati, and I had a fellowship director named Lori Shutter, and Dr. Shutter saw the future back in the early 2000s and invited me and 3 of my colleagues to train in neurocritical care. And we were the first emergency physicians to ever be board certified in neurocritical care in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, it was great. So
incredible.
Yeah, so she launched us on this pretty amazing path where we got to take these leadership roles to join emergency medicine and neurocritical care together over a series of years, and we've all been able to do some pretty fun things with it. And then I really gravitated towards the really sick patients, and many of those are contained in the cardiac ICU at the University of Cincinnati. And I was invited to join that faculty group and work with the anesthesia critical care team, where we take care of our cardiac critical care patients. So the patients whose hearts are failing and they need mechanical circulatory support. So ECMO, which you mentioned, which is essentially heart-lung bypass at the bedside. It works for a heart that doesn't work, works for lungs that don't work, and it works for hearts and lungs that don't work together. And it gives us an opportunity to let patients heal if they can, or find them a destination, either an artificial heart equivalent, transplant. And sometimes we're not successful and we have to ease them into end of life.
Yeah, it's an incredible and rich existence in terms of the impact you're making on a day to day basis. But let's move on to talking, because it's a natural progression to talking about the new Flex ICU.
Yeah.
And I want to read some excerpts from the press release and some of the things we've seen in the press. But I noted one of the words in the release was talking about ecosystem. It actually was in the context of entrepreneurial ecosystem. And it's interesting because we've had a lot of conversations about entrepreneurship and, generally speaking, whether it's in healthcare or other sectors. And truly, because I know there were a lot of people involved in it. There's a reason you were cutting the ribbon in that video. But it talks about leveraging the entrepreneurial ecosystem of this region, kind of the Midwest, the tri-state region here, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, to drive healthcare innovation forward. And I know you were the driving force behind the design and development of this Flex ICU, and it's the first ICU dedicated specifically to ultra early care and resuscitation of critically ill patients in the region. And really, it's the first inpatient facility of its kind in the country. Talk to me a little bit about how that conversation started. Clearly, there was a need for it, no question. But how did that actually, in the early days, come to be a conversation? and then ultimately not only strategy but implementation, kind of what time frame are we talking about? Who started the conversation? How did you make it a reality?
That is a heck of a question, Rob. So we first started talking about this back in 2007.
Wow.
Yeah, and then in 2010 we got the green light to build it the first time, and then there were other needs for the health system that actually required transitioning funds and effort to building something else that we needed instead. So it got put a bit on the back burner. And then some other institutions built something in their emergency departments. The ICUs actually contained inside their ERs, because we recognize that the faster you bring care to patients who are critically ill and injured, the better they're going to do. And in an emergency department, your job is to figure out what's going on, stabilize them, and then get them out. You have to get them out. And it's not because you can't take care of them, and it's not because you don't want to. It's because you have a lobby full of patients waiting to be taken care of. You have ambulances and helicopters coming in. And if you're done resuscitating and stabilizing a patient, they have to go. That's where the system fails. Our ICUs are full all the time. They run at greater than 95% occupancy. So you can almost never get a bed in an ICU in America. Our boarding times in America are significantly higher than anywhere else in the world, yet we have 10 times more ICU beds per capita than most other developed nations. So we had to find a different solution. And one of the solutions is, if you can identify specific patients who are going to be best served by the ultra rapid care, and rather than need 5 days in the hospital, you can shrink that to 2. You can then open up downstream availability. You can open up front stream availability by moving them out of an emergency department into a new ICU level like our Flex ICU. And then you create those open beds in the ER, and then you can move these patients faster through a Flex system. But you have to really focus on the right kinds of patients, and you have to be innovative. You can't allow yourselves to sort of be stuck in the traditional way that medicine works, which is a little bit ponderous, frankly. I mean, progress in operations in medicine is largely glacial, right? People just sort of evolve over time in their systems. Incremental change happens. We hire consultants. They come in from all the big firms. They tell us to be more efficient, be faster, few heads roll, and then nothing really changes, frankly, because if there were innovative solutions that have worked in the past, we would all know them and we'd all be using them. They're just not there. So we did have this forward-looking vision, and we really started pushing hard around 2015, 16. And unfortunately, COVID derailed us a little bit, as you might expect. We had to channel our focus onto the pandemic. But prior to that, we had begun this process of figuring out, like, what's next? What's the next thing that we can do to innovate for rapid, effective care so that we can create at least the illusion of greater capacity? My goal is to never say no to a patient who needs my system. So academic medical centers with all of the subspecialty care are the places that lots of people want to be when it's really complicated or undifferentiated. You can be at a small, rural, critical access hospital, clearly identified as critically ill. It might be hard to know what's wrong with you because of the diagnostic capabilities at that institution. We need to be able to just say yes to those patients. Like, send them to me. We'll figure it out. We have the biggest team in the world to do this. It's not about individual people. It's about the teams and the systems. So creating the capacity to bring those patients immediately as just say yes patients was really a big part of the drive to create the Flex ICU. And then the recognition that we need to partner with our brightest minds who are involved in tech innovation in healthcare to leverage all of the developments that we currently have. I mean, if you look at the way we actually take care of patients, we have this massive electronic health record system. The government told us that it had to be meaningful use, but it's hard. It's hard to actually make it meaningful. It's so big and so cumbersome. And every system has its flaws. There's data contained in that system for every single patient in real time that we simply don't access well. So figuring out from an innovation standpoint how to leverage our tech so that we can create the appropriate software filtering, AI-driven deep learning methods to identify who's sick. Because Rob, if you're in my ICU and you're looking okay, but the machines are recognizing that something's getting unstable and I can't see it with my naked eye, but it can, and it warns me and says, hey, Rob's getting unstable, I can intervene before you get sicker. That's the chance to make a difference. And that's actually what the Flex ICU is built for. We're trying really hard to create those partnerships. And we build a very modular ICU as a result.
It's interesting. And I think, it takes a lot of entrepreneurship and outside the box thinking to make this work. But there's a lot to unpack in what you said. First of all, the glacial pace, we've heard that before. In some ways, medicine moves very quickly, other ways, much more slowly. It seems, what you're saying seems in hindsight so obvious, identify early. It's certainly something that's almost a truism in medicine. prevention, early identification. What do you think it was? Because 2007 and what you're doing is somewhat unique. And still, I'm sure other future ICUs and Flex ICUs are going to learn from what you're doing now. What do you think is really causing? I mean, is it just because there's so much information and so much to put together in making this a reality, and not to mention the money needed to make it happen? But what is it that is and again, this is a culmination of a dream that's going to make such a positive impact on so many lives. What is it about this endeavor that made it such a slow process? And again, the reality is this is a win because you got to the finish line. But is it all the things I'm talking about, all the pieces to put together? And can we see it as accelerating from here now that you've got a proof of concept?
Yes, the proof of concept is what was necessary for other places to begin to look at this. And the proof of concept for similar but not same ICUs exists already. The University of Michigan was one of the leaders in this. They built something called the Emergency Critical Care Center, which they call EC3. We have to have fancy names for everything in medicine, and it's got to be a cool acronym. So EC3 is pretty slick. And EC3 is an emergency department-based unit that does something reasonably similar to what Flex is trying to do. But my Flex unit is actually an inpatient unit. So the politics of that are important. We can accept patients from other institutions that are already admitted. We can accept patients from ERs outside and not violate laws around transfer protocols. But the glacial pace that you described is mired in the politics of medicine. It would be lovely if all of the houses of medicine were aligned around patient care primarily. And I would tell you that the physicians largely are. But I'm outnumbered 20-1 by administrators in healthcare now. Right. It's not that dissimilar to a military model. The administrators outnumber us by this massive number because the administration of medicine is so complicated. Right. When you start talking to anybody who's well versed in the finances of medicine, it's like a lesson in a form of economics that makes absolutely zero sense. It's a finite bucket that everyone's trying to expand, knowing that you can't expand it. So you just start playing a game of like who you're going to cut and where you're going to find the resources to do these increasingly expensive interventions for which there's no funding. So the politics that are mired in it, both from an economic standpoint as well as a turf standpoint, were a big deal. So we get along really well with critical care physicians now as emergency doctors. But up until the mid 2000s, I wasn't allowed to do critical care in the hospital as an emergency physician because at the creation of the emergency medicine specialty some 50 years ago, there was a back of the napkin agreement that said we would never step foot in the hospital, just the ER. We weren't even allowed to do inpatient medicine if we trained in emergency medicine. So my ancestors, right, who started the specialty with their vision, had to give up inpatient medicine as a potential career for emergency trained people because we were not welcome. So it took us years to break down the silos. And we did that in the early 2000s. But when I say I was one of the first four, I mean, really one of the first four to become board certified in a critical care specialty after doing emergency medicine. You could do the training, but you couldn't get board certified. That didn't happen until the late 2000s.
That's incredible. And we're talking 15 years ago, really.
Right?
Yeah. And it's eye-opening.
And since then, emergency physicians make up more than 50% of the cadre of all critical care trainees because we love critical care. It's just what we do, right? And we move pretty quickly and we think well, and we have reasonable procedural skills when we come out of training. So that politics played such an important factor in the slow growth of these new kinds of intensive care units that are largely focused on the movement of emergency medicine patients. We're there now. I mean, I've got great partners now, and they see it and they're helpful and it's wonderful. But like this last weekend, I mean, I took a number of calls that were essentially political calls trying to help move patients through the system because that's growth, right? It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, there's politics and sales and everything we do, right?
You're right.
That's part of the drill. Interesting, and such a great summary of the impact of your new Flex ICU. Congratulations again.
Thanks.
I know we've talked a couple times, and I know you've put in more than a couple of 100-hour weeks, literally, and no joke. And thank you, the community, and I hope more broadly than just this community will benefit from all of the work that you and your team have put in. I'd be interested, you talked briefly about the pandemic slowing you down. In the context of Flex ICU and more broadly, I'd be curious what lessons were learned, maybe some good, some bad, during the pandemic that may impact the delivery of care moving forward.
Yeah.
Just generally speaking, we're still fresh off of that. It's been a relatively recent uh, phenomenon, and we're at a point now where I think we're starting to figure out where we go from here, broadly speaking. But I'd be curious what your take is on that because you have a somewhat unique perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I was essentially ground zero for the pandemic here in Cincinnati, being an emergency medicine doctor who does critical care, and got leaned on to do some pretty difficult things. One of which was our scarce resource allocation team, where every day we looked at the list of patients on ventilators and those who needed them, and started making decisions about who, if we had to, would we consider removing from a ventilator because they no longer had an opportunity to recover, and we needed that for someone else. Thankfully, we never got to that state here, but we did get to that state with ECMO equipment. And it was exceptionally painful. I mean, we're not used to rationing healthcare in America. So big picture, what do I think? I think that Americans got a bit of a wake up call, and they realized that we're not immune to the lack of resources that the rest of the world feels on a daily basis. I mean, I've been in places where I have 7 ventilators for 1 million people. And it's a terrible decision making process. It's gut wrenching. And we saw that in America for the first time ever. We really didn't have enough for everyone. I remember when our first doses of Paxlovid came in under armed guard. I mean, the state police brought them in like armored vehicles because we were worried about the drugs getting taken. That's wild, right? So America got to see the fact that we're not invincible medically. But what we saw on the medical practitioner side, all of us who were at the bedside, we suffered this moral injury that was new to us. We got caught in a political quagmire about whether or not vaccines worked, whether or not the government was involved in a conspiracy around dosing of drugs. We got caught up in politics, which had really been something that we'd been able to avoid at the bedside. Your personal politics being whatever they are, at the bedside, that's generally hallowed ground where we don't worry about that. We don't have to talk about it. At the same time, being accused by patient families of withholding medications because of government conspiracies was just really painful, frankly. And the public trust in physicians was eroded by our politicians, and it was done in front of our faces. So while we're facing potential death and illness ourselves, caring for these patients, doing the best that we can, we have politicians throwing mud on us as specialties, on the system in general, on the NIH. We look at these government agencies for guidance and we trust them. I trust Anthony Fauci. The textbook that I studied, Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, right? He was an editor. To have to deal with that while trying to take care of patients was exceptionally difficult because you had to be really abreast of all of the developments politically, plus the scientific developments, plus trying to take care of yourself, plus trying to take care of your family and keep everyone safe. And it was just a lot to do. And I don't think everyone had the bandwidth for it, frankly. And it got really frustrating. I was accused a number of times of withholding vaccine from patients who were dying, but it wasn't indicated any longer. You can't vaccinate somebody who's near death. One, it was ineffective, and two, it could stretch the system to the point where it would have been potentially lethal. And that was the first time I've ever been accused by people to my face of causing intentional harm to our patients. And it was really painful.
Yeah, that's really incredibly difficult. One of my questions for you was going to be, have you ever felt anxiety or fear? Again, I know you and I know what you do on a daily basis. I know what your work life is and your personal life is, and you like the adrenaline. You're not somebody I would ever describe as scared of anything. But, talking about the pandemic and just in general, do you ever feel anxiety or fear in your day to day? Or are you you don't want to be emotionally immune from what's going on around you? And what you just described, I'm sure was incredibly difficult for you and painful because you want to help people and make a positive impact. But, the pandemic maybe is one example, but generally speaking, are there situations you find yourself? We all have our own issues to deal with personally, professionally, but what makes you fearful or anxious? And you just described one situation that was obviously very difficult for you, but generally speaking, are there other examples of that as well?
Yeah. So, Rob, I'll start and say I could probably divide this broadly into 2 buckets. And the overarching statement is I have anxiety and fear every day that I work. And the day that I don't, I should probably retire. Because
Right.
if I'm not anxious that I'm doing the right thing for somebody, if I'm not concerned that I'm potentially making the wrong decision, then I'm not being intellectually honest. I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this a long time, but there's always questions, and I should always be humble enough to ask those every day, like internal checks. Am I doing the right thing? Did I do the right thing on that ventilator? Did I choose the right medicine? Did I make the right diagnosis? And I take those decisions home with me every night. Absolutely. There's another bit of anxiety that comes from the emotional toll of what we do. And I know that to do my job well, I have to engage on an emotional level that is going to hurt me. It's going to take something out of me, right? If you make it through your critical illness, it's because you were lucky and we did some things that probably helped. I'm not going to take credit for it, but I was there at the bedside sweating over it, right? And if you don't make it, then, by God, my job is to make sure that you die well and your family engages in that experience in a way that's meaningful and bears them no regret long term. And that is quite hallowed ground to walk on. And I fear every day that I don't do it right. Is there more I could have done for someone? Is there some suffering I could have prevented? End of life is hard. And I say this to my trainees all the time. There are no participation trophies in death. And you have to do it right for your patients. So yeah, that is certainly fearful. And then frankly, the medical legal environment in which we practice is difficult. I work in a field where upwards of 20% of my patients are going to die. And the number of times that an angry family will say something like, we're going to sue you if, uncle whomever doesn't live. You learn to let that roll off your back. They're angry and they're scared, and you work to partner with them to help them understand the realities of what's going on. But no physician wants to sort of see the medical legal machine in the background trying to chop off their head for doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult reality of what we do. More often than not, I have to counsel a younger physician or a trainee who's experiencing this, where they've been threatened by a family. And I remind them, like, there's a lot of protections in there too. Do the right thing for the patient, make the best decision you can. And you're going to make mistakes at some point in your career. That is a truism. Failure is not an option. Failure happens. So, work on your skills for resilience and then do your best every day.
Yeah, resilience is a word I try to talk to my kids about on a very consistent basis. And it's almost a cliche now to say you fail in life, you learn from it, but that resilience is incredibly important in how you live your life.
It is.
It's interesting when go ahead.
I was just going to say, for physicians on the sharp end in critical care and emergency medicine, failure often means someone's death, or an outcome where there's significant morbidity. And that is really hard to shoulder. I mean, losing money is hard. Making a bad investment is difficult. Losing your house is hard. Your children being disappointed in you for a decision you make where you failed. Those are all difficult. And we can bear those differently, I think, than when someone else's life has been harmed by a decision that we make. That kind of failure eats at you. And you got to have a way to get through it. And often it's talking to other people about it. But frankly, and this is sort of a sad road to take in this conversation, but the rates of self-harm and suicide in critical care and emergency physicians is extraordinary. We are not immune to it. I mean, we lost some colleagues, not locally, but we lost colleagues in our field in the last 2 years pretty publicly. We lost them during COVID. Physicians taking their own lives because they felt so bad about what was happening and they couldn't handle it. That is a tragedy. And I wish there were more that we could do to stop that.
Well, on that subject, I want to talk because I think you do a lot to take care of yourself physically and mentally. So I want to come back to your CrossFit gym and ownership because I think that's a good thing for you. And it's good for other people too, but I think it's a healthy outlet for you. Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to hear more about that. I do want to make mention of something, the question about fear and anxiety and things kind of weighing on you on a very small scale. So when I was in high school, I worked at a long-term rehab center and was exposed to a lot of people with spinal cord injuries, young people, motorcycle accidents, swimming accidents, things like that. And I also worked at University of Michigan at the Adolescent Psychiatric Hospital and seeing some pretty tough things there. It paid great, but it paid great for a college student for a reason. It was a difficult, challenging job. And it obviously doesn't come close to what you experience. But the question, and hearing you talk about it, I remember how much it weighed me down and how much, on a very entry level type of role, how much I thought about those people on a day in, day out basis. And you deal with this every day. This is your life, your vocation. So the genesis of that question kind of leads me into asking about some of the mission trips you've taken, for example, Haiti and the chaos of that after the earthquake. I mean, you talked about rationing care. You talked about, limited number of ventilators. I think you said 7 for 1 million people. I'm sure that enters your worldview when you practice medicine. but can you give us a sense of whether it would be Haiti or other examples of some of the missions you've gone on, what that experience is like?
Oh yeah. I would say that every one of those trips left a mark. And the probably shortest answer to all of it is just a sense of humility. Um, we have so much in the US. We have so much healthcare that we can provide. And when you go to these resource limited environments and you say to yourself, like, if I just had a blank, I could keep this person alive. If I just did this, I could keep that person alive. If I just had one more liter of IV fluid, that patient would have survived, but I can't give them 9 liters. They're only allowed to get 8 because that's the way the system rations their care. It is humbling, and culturally, it's remarkable to watch the teams try to interact with each other and with the patients in environments where they're not familiar with the local culture. Um, I remember working in South Africa and having a couple of really shocking experiences early on in my time there, where patients died for things that were totally salvageable here. I mean, remarkably so. I remember calling for I was working very far north on the eastern coast of South Africa, just south of Mozambique, and I had a very sick patient, and I called for the one fixed wing aircraft on the east coast out of Durban that could come and get him. And it was end of day, and there's a grass runway, and they can get there, they can get back, and that's about it. And I called for the aircraft, and I remember being told he has to survive. If you're wrong, it's a waste of a trip, and it puts other people at risk, and you're taking the only aircraft out of service. Are you sure he's going to make it? I'm a young physician. I was like, well, he'd make it at home. Like, if I were flying on the aircraft, I'm sure I could. So I said, send him. And the aircraft lands, and they take off, and they land again, and they push his dead body out, and they say he didn't make it, and they flew back to Durban. I was like, are you serious? And then I got chewed out for having called an aircraft for someone who wasn't going to make it. And that was, again, left the mark, right? And you realize that in resource limited environments, you have to make a different call sometimes, and you have to really increase that threshold level for survival before you put assets at risk and you take assets out of service because other people need them. We just don't deal with that kind of limited resource allocation in the US. So it's a language that we're very unfamiliar with. During I was in Haiti at the peak of the cholera epidemic as well. And I remember they brought in essentially these flatbed trucks. They'd gone around to the communities, and they'd taken these people who were clearly sick with cholera, and they had collected them all in a flatbed truck, and they brought them to us, and they laid them out in our parking lot of the hospital. And my job with the chief nurse from that Haitian hospital was to go and see every one of them and decide who we could try to save, because we didn't have enough supplies. Some of them were so far gone that even if we had tried, we just would have prolonged their deaths. And that is not something that no matter how good of an emergency physician you are, no matter how well trained you are, that is not something that you're used to doing, nor have much experience in. And that level triage was, it was just mind boggling. And to see biblical suffering, we're just not often exposed to it. So you bring those lessons back too. And you bring that gratitude back, and you remember how lucky you are to practice in the environments that you're in, and how grateful you are that, you call 911 in Cincinnati, you're getting an ambulance or a helicopter within 15 minutes, no matter where you are. Just like think about that. That's incredible, right? We're so lucky. Most places around the world don't have anything like that.
Yeah. It is staggering, and it must have shaped your worldview from the time you started going on those missions in a pretty profound way. We are very fortunate to have, the ability to access medical care in all levels. You've talked a little bit about that piece of it, but I think it's also fascinating. You got involved with the SWAT team as a flight physician. I know you don't do that anymore because you have so many other responsibilities. But I can imagine there are some friendships and interesting stories along the way from, for example, the SWAT team. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those guys have made their way to the CrossFit gym. Do you still think about those types of things? I know you gave it up because you have other things going on. What was that experience like in the context of your overall day-to-day existence? How much a part of it? Was it a great learning experience? Are you glad it's in the rearview mirror?
Yeah.
How did it shape you? All those good things.
Sure. No, I'm so sad that it's in the rearview mirror. It's something I think about almost on a daily basis. It was my favorite series of years of certainly my life as a physician. I was lucky enough to join this tactical medicine program. It's one of the things that brought me to Cincinnati. When you train here in Cincinnati as an emergency physician, you get to be crew on air care. And then we had a tactical medicine program where we got to work with Cincinnati Police SWAT and the FBI SWAT teams, and got to work with Secret Service too on some presidential details, and it's just spectacular. But the teammates that I had on that Cincinnati Police SWAT team who opened their hearts to training a physician to be a part of it and help. I mean, I'll never forget the friendships. I'm still very close to a few guys on the team. I'll never forget the training. I still am pretty good at walking into a room and knowing where the exits are and how long it's going to take me to get to either one. Identifying who's a threat and who isn't. It reinforced a lifelong love of shooting that I still do and I still train. In fact, I'm going out this weekend to a 4-day close quarters battle tactical rifle training program. It's something that is still very much a part of my mentality, and I'm deeply respectful for what they taught me and the work that these guys do. I mean, the Cincinnati Police SWAT team was made up of just outstanding professionals. And I learned a lot and I miss them very much. I wish I could still do it, but I am getting older, and I can only be awake 24 hours in a row for so many times each week. And it's a young man's game, and it's okay to pass it on to the next generation, but I do miss it.
It's excellent and impactful work that they do on a daily basis. And I've heard a couple of stories from you over time, and it sounds like great work was done in your collaboration. So speaking of which, young man's game, all that stuff, you're still a young man. You're taking good care of yourself. But from a, sleep, scheduling, managing work-life balance, I mentioned your family. You've got 2 great boys who I want to talk about in a second in terms of what they've learned from you and your wife. But how do you, 100-hour weeks takes a lot out of you. I know even a normal week, maybe it's not 100 hours, but it's still a lot of hours. You're still doing a lot of different things. How do you navigate that? How much sleep do you generally need? How do you maintain a full tank of gas? Figuratively, that
Yeah.
is. I know you drive a Tesla, so maybe it's not a full tank of gas. But how do you kind of navigate that and take care of yourself?
Well, I've got a Jeep for the zombie apocalypse, right? Because we're going to need gas
Okay,
then.
good. Yeah, for sure.
But how much sleep one needs and how much sleep one can function on are actually a little bit different. And like anything else, training yourself to function while fatigued is possible. I know it flies in the face of the wellness discussions that we have all the time, and the ones that I have with my athletes and my trainees, where I tell them you got to sleep as much as possible, 8 hours a night, et cetera. The truth is, I survive on 6 or 7 most nights, and I can go with a lot less. I have to have a recovery day here or there. For me, the most important thing is actually discipline around nutrition. And I think that's the secret weapon that people often forget. So, 21 years of working at UC Health, I've really never eaten in the cafeteria. I pack my food every day. So that takes me an extra 10 or 15 minutes. Even if I'm doing a 24-hour duty cycle in the hospital, I pack everything I need. And I'm really focused on my nutrition. That has been something that I would continue to suggest as a strategy to everyone. It is far more important to be cognizant of and careful with your nutrition than it is to drive yourself into the ground working out when you're exhausted. Although you can still do more when you're tired than you think you can. I love David Goggins, right? Pretty impressive in lots of ways. I think that there's an extreme beyond which I don't want people to go, and maybe some of the stuff that he talks about, although he's been an inspiration to me forever. And it's really just asking myself that question, like, am I okay? Can I do more? And, maybe after working super hard for 2 straight days and I'm exhausted, I'm not going to go and pull the heaviest weight I possibly can, but I'm going to go move and I'm going to do something. 20 minutes is better than 0 minutes, even if it's not your goal. So something is always better than nothing. And I try to get that message through to the people that I train. And for me, so I'm disciplined about my nutrition. I never really vary from it. And then I am as disciplined as I can be with my physical fitness, with the understanding that there are days where I have to turn the knob left. I hate those days. I'm not good at knowing when I have to take those days. I have friends who will often tell me to take those days, the people who coach with me, and I just listen to them. And it's been helpful. I know I harped on it a couple of times already, but I'm just going to throw it out again. Like the nutrition matters so much more than people think. I mean, if you go back to the original days of Hippocrates, right? The first medicine that we had was diet. It was just nutrition. And we recognized back then, right? Eat enough to sustain lean muscle mass. Don't eat so much that you become obese. Fuel yourself with enough protein. Carbs are fine. Good fats are good. Just like do that stuff. And it really does pay dividends over time.
Yeah. I met David Goggins. I had the misfortune of speaking before him at a conference a while back.
Mhm.
Obviously, nobody remembered what I said, but he's an incredible guy. But I will tell you, in person, he came across as a much more mild-mannered than he may come across when he's speaking. An incredible guy, an incredible story. But I think about, what you're talking about, a couple things. One is, it's interesting. I've read some books lately about sleep related to sleep deprivation versus just insomnia.
Mhm.
And they seem to me to be two very different things. That people get stressed about not sleeping enough, which creates this whole cycle of anxiety. But the reality is, you're right, we can function on much less sleep. Now, depriving yourself of sleep is another story, but I know people are worried about the negative health byproducts. But I think probably the worst piece of it is to get anxious about sleep and just function how you can and what you need to do. And I think that's interesting. The other piece is, with the advent of people like Peter Attia, other longevity, functional medicine types of people, I think more and more people are talking about the functional medicine piece and nutrition and everything else, what you're talking about. But I think some people get in their own way, and it goes to what you just said. It's fairly obvious what you should be doing. Now, there's layers of that, right? You want to take it to the next level. But any thoughts on all these people that are longevity experts recommending, 20 supplements a day? There's a lot to do with that, and you can embrace all of that. But I'm just wondering where you think the line is with everything, whether it be sleep, whether it be diet, exercise. Is it possible to go too far? Like you said, 20 minutes is better than zero.
Right.
I'd be curious what your take is on all of that.
Well, I have lived for a long time with the idea that perfect is the enemy of good.
Yeah.
And I think I'm one of these people who I'm not the best at anything. I'm pretty good at a number of things, and I'm able to just sort of integrate the area under the curve to be effective in the roles that I have. That's what I suggest to most people, is try to be good, not perfect, at as much as you can. If you can be good with your nutrition, but not perfect, like 80-20 is the rule that we all talk about. 80% of the time you're really good. 20% of the time you eat like a raccoon, right? That's fine. 20% of your week eating pizza and hot dogs is not going to kill you. The 80% is going to keep you alive when you eat well. Same thing with your exercise. If you can get there 80% of the time to your goal, that's great. If you can read 80% of the books you need to read instead of 100, that's all fine. And I use this 80% threshold. I don't want people to be scared. Like, I did better than that in medical school, I think. But, conceptually, that 80-20 rule, do good, don't worry about being perfect, is probably pretty helpful. There is absolutely too much that we can do. The truth, though, is we don't know enough from a science standpoint to say what is really beneficial yet. The work that people like Dr. Attia are doing, which is spectacular work, bringing into the public consciousness, having conversations about it. I mean, how many friends do you have on social media now who are going rucking every weekend, right? Rucking was not anything other than a typo 4 years ago, right?
My wife included.
Great. So now we're all throwing on weight vests and going rucking on the weekends. That's awesome. That influence has been spectacular. People are talking about the metabolic syndrome. We're considering skeletal muscle as a muscle group and organ system now. That's awesome. We're talking about putting money in the bank for retirement and muscle mass in the bank for retirement. Those are great conversations, and I love the catalyst that they've been for those conversations. Do I know which supplements to take? I have no idea. Does anybody? We really don't. We have some ideas, but we are not perfectly aligned with the science, and we have to admit that. So, are you someone who buys into the science? Cool. Try it. If you're not and you want to be a little more hands-off, that's fine. But eat well, exercise, sleep when you can, stay hydrated. Those are all pretty reasonable rules. And I don't think we need to subject those to rigorous science. Like, I don't need to see the randomized controlled trial of somebody who drinks water and doesn't drink water to know that the person who doesn't drink water is more likely to wind up with a kidney stone and a ruptured tendon. It's just obvious, right? There's this really funny article from years ago in the British Medical Journal. And the article was the use of parachutes to reduce gravitational induced trauma, a randomized controlled trial. And they could not enroll anyone in the trial because no one was willing to get randomized to get thrown out of an aircraft without a parachute to prove that parachutes worked. And in the end, the authors essentially say, don't sacrifice your common sense on the altar of evidence, right? I feel like some of that is where we should be in a world now. We're so interested in what the next influencer says and the last article that they've dissected. Yeah. And the truth is, we've known much of this for so long. I mean, you want advice on how to stay healthy? Talk to your 100-year-old grandparents, right? They did it.
There's a piece in Peter Attia's book talking about caloric restriction, and some guy, I think from the 16th century, who got healthy, was overweight, and lived for that time frame, an ungodly long life because he restricted his calories. That was 500-600 years ago. There's something to common sense. And I think those are words to live by that you just put out there. We know what the answers are in large part. Can we learn? Absolutely, every day. But your words are ringing very true for me. And I think that's important for us all to keep in mind. Now, speaking of health, wellness, and longevity, let's talk about your CrossFit gym that you now co-own. And I want to read a couple of excerpts from your CrossFit bio, which I found very Jordan Bonomo-esque. Jordan came to CrossFit after an athletic career playing rugby in college, competing in MMA, and then endurance sports, including Ironman distance triathlons and ultra running. He focuses his coaching on helping athletes work through mobility limitations and understanding the biomechanics of movement, translating CrossFit's functional exercises into sustainable movement patterns applicable to real life. His love of anatomy, and this is one of my favorite parts of the bio, his love of anatomy and geeky obsession with mobility leads to a focus on form and stability to enhance safety under load. Furthermore, a physics dork as well, he loves to imagine the formula at work as a barbell floats along a virtuous path from floor to overhead. That's Jordan Bonomo to a T. And by the way, I will comment that you've already told me that my wife has much better form in the gym than I do. I'm still working on that, Jordan. I don't want to let you down. But, you've got a million things going on. CrossFit is actually, a passion not only for you and your wife, your two boys, I think, as well. And so tell me a little bit about what that experience has been like. I know the story behind getting involved, but tell our listeners a little bit about why you decided to do that and how it's going now.
Yeah, so I spent a career doing lots of athletics, trying to find the thing that fit, and then I started doing Ironman work, and then I had to have my hip operated on, and I started running ultra distance stuff. And a friend of mine looked at me one day when I was a pretty skinny vegan ultra runner and said, "I just met these people who take their shirts off, eat raw meat, and throw weights around. And I think that they're kind of like the intensity that you're going to want in life. So will you go meet them?" And I was like, "Sure, sounds crazy. I'm a vegan. I won't eat meat." And then I walked into the gym and I was like, I found my tribe. I found my people. They were screaming and they were laughing and they were throwing barbells in ways I'd never seen. I was like, this is really cool. And I actually hadn't heard very much about CrossFit at the time. It was in the 2010, 12 range. So I started trying it and really liked it. And then started reading more about the philosophy behind it. And like all things in life, politics can ruin the most beautiful experience. The non-political version of CrossFit, functional movements performed at high intensity, varied over multiple domains, is spectacular. If we can teach people to move well and help them sustain those movement patterns over a lifetime, you're not the grandparent walking with a cane. You're the grandparent throwing your grandkid in a pool, right? The power around that is just exceptional. And it takes a really good coach to teach you to move well. We all have these ingrained patterns of movement. There are these archetypical movement patterns: pushing, pressing, jumping, squatting. And we lose the ability to do them over a lifetime because we sit in chairs, we stand at desks, our backs start to hurt, our knees get a little tweaky, and we don't squat the right way anymore, so we stop squatting. And then it's hard to bend over, so we don't bend over, so we stop deadlifting. And then we get hurt picking up a backpack, right? That's what I think the beauty of CrossFit actually is from a longevity standpoint, is teaching those movement patterns in a way that they're virtuous forever. My kids started when they were young. I mean, I started pushing them in the gym at 4 and 5, not lifting heavy weights, but working these movement patterns. And they have perfect squats. They have perfect presses, perfect jumps. And I think that that's the way our body was designed to work. I've often said that CrossFit's the instruction manual our bodies didn't come with, but should have. So not all CrossFit's the same. Yeah, not all CrossFit's the same. CrossFit Cincinnati, which I co-own and run, we're really focused on that stuff. The perfect movement patterns, the not increasing load until people are ready for it. And my favorite thing to do at that gym is to take someone who has been not particularly athletic for the last however many years, probably in their mid 30s to 40s, and teach them to squat again And then 3 months later, they high five me as they're back squatting their body weight. And they're profoundly moved by their capacity to be an athlete again, right? And then their life changes because they're stronger, they're faster, they're happier, they have a community. One of the Peter Attia's greatest points in his book Outlive is that community matters and you have to belong to something. We've created a community and an ecosystem at this gym where people belong and they want to come and be there for the best hour of every one of their days. Someone gets sick at the gym, it's an instant meal train. Someone needs a ride somewhere, rides are available. It takes the place of what a lot of religious communities likely did in the past. And as we're seeing a bit of a decline in the observance of traditional religion in this country, supplanting it with something that is health focused and community driven, I think is really valuable. And I think it gives people that outlet that they don't always find anymore in traditional religious environments, although some clearly do still. So I love it. I think it's been great. I love my coaching staff. We have an awesome time working together. It's a great outlet for me. I run a men's mental health group out of the gym. I made a promise some years ago that I would suicide proof my gym to the best of my ability. And we all know that men don't have a safe place to talk about the things that are emotionally difficult, that are, generating vulnerability. And we created that environment. So we have this men's mental health group with the stated goal of keeping everyone safe and above ground. And
It's awesome.
I mean, that means so much to me, to see my guys, and we've done a good job so far, giving this place, creating a place where people can share, openly. And I've shared my own story with mental health, with my guys, and I've been at the bottom before, and knowing that I've been there and that I can get out of it, and they know that they can get out of it. It's been powerful to say the least.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. I can hear it in your voice how important it is. And it's more important now than ever. I mean, post pandemic, in a world where we lock ourselves into social media, staring at our phone, that sense of community. And it's a really interesting point you made in terms of the CrossFit community that you've built. I know not all CrossFits are created equal and you want to stay above any kind of politics, but it's that physical health, but also the mental health and that safe place that you've created. And I kudos to you for creating a gym and a place that is really what you set out to make, and for the people that are part of that gym, knowing that they have that sense of community is incredibly important. And I love the idea of suicide proofing the members of that gym. That should be a model we use across the board, because it's not only about physical health, it's about mental health as well, and it all ties together, obviously. So
Well,
kudos to you.
thanks, Rob.
Yeah, and yeah,
I,
absolutely. It's incredibly important. Go ahead.
you know, I come from a place and from people who taught me that we are our brother's keeper, right? And my job isn't to get nosy into your life. My job is to help you stand up when you're going to fall down. There are all of these sayings out there. Look for the helpers, right? I wanted to create an environment of helpers, and that's really where the gym is. That's where all of the people I interact with on a daily basis in my medical practice are. They're the people who want to help and want to create safety and protection for those around us. There's I tell people that sometimes the only place you can cry safely is over a barbell, because there's this alignment, right? Like your heart hurts and your body hurts, and all of a sudden the pieces of that puzzle click together, and you have access to the space that you need to access that you just can't elsewhere. Whether it's similar to meditation or flow or any of the other ways that people connect with themselves. But we lost the founder of our gym. Reiner Hartman was the founder of CrossFit Cincinnati and the owner and operator until I bought the gym from him. And Reiner died 3 weeks ago from ALS.
Sorry.
Yeah, and he was a good friend and someone that the community really respected. And I felt his loss. I took care of him in the ICU actually. But
Oh, wow.
yeah, he didn't die under my watch. He was able to go home with hospice and he died there, which is what he wanted. But I felt his loss poignantly. But the tears didn't come until I was pulling on a barbell in his gym that I bought from him, right? And then I was like, okay. And then my friends were there and they saw it and they knew what it was. And it was just this very powerful sense of community and healing. That's what it can be. It's not that for everybody, but it can certainly be that in the right place.
Absolutely. And how appropriate, like you can grieve properly in the gym that he built in the first place, right?
Over the barbell he taught me to lift.
But by the way, and I think this is incredibly important too, and I know your kids are great boys. They having that foundation and exercise, and also what you and Andrea have taught them over time. But as it relates to CrossFit specifically, to have that gift of having those tools for working out for a lifetime, longevity, mental health, all of that, I think puts them in a really good place. And that's something to emulate, I think, as I think about families and raising kids. So I love the what you've done on the CrossFit side and your spare time after you work 100-hour week. I'm sure you've got plenty of free time. Which leads me to just to tie things up here, because it's an incredibly rich life you're leading and so incredibly impactful. When you think about the next 5-10 years, do you have, again, you've already accomplished a lot and you're more than a little busy right now in getting the Flex ICU off the ground and everything you're doing. But are there things that you have on your bucket list, things that you want to do personally and professionally that are kind of hanging out there? And again, if the answer is, I've already done enough, haven't I? That the answer would be yes.
Oh man, that would not be my answer. There's always more to do.
I didn't think so.
Yeah, no, there's always more to do. You got to be front side focused, right? You can't look in the rearview mirror and congratulate yourself for stuff you've already done. That's not the way this world works. I'm a father of a soon to be college age son. I want to see him launch out of the nest the right way to the right place. It's going to be good for him. My wife is an amazing physician, and she has other things in her life that she'd also like to do. And I would like to help her find those opportunities. I don't think she's going to give up her clinical practice anytime soon, but the opportunity to have a pretty big impact on the world again, especially around issues related to women's health and women's healthcare rights, I think is something that I would love to support her in. From my perspective, I have a startup that I've been working on for a couple of years now with a business partner. It's in, we'll call it AI analytics for medicine. I would love to see what we're working on actually make it to the next stage. It's something that has the potential, we think, to be transformative for preventative healthcare and save a whole bunch of lives that right now are sort of blindly lost because the system is there with the information, but no one knows how to analyze it. And I think that we figured that out. Would really like to see that happen. And frankly, I've had this opportunity finally with this Flex ICU to build a team that I handpicked and believe deeply in. I want to mentor that team to take over. My goal is not to run this for very long. I want to give it to them, and I want them to run it and take it to the next level. And I'd like to move on to that next innovative experience inside healthcare.
Well, I'm excited to see what comes next, Jordan. And as it relates to the medical AI startup, I'm not surprised. You're an entrepreneurial guy with that type of mindset. So love to keep talking to you about the startup and everything you're doing. What a pleasure to talk to you about the many things you're doing to make the world a better place. And I certainly learned a lot, even though we're friends already from just having this conversation. Sometimes it's nice to sit down and actually talk it through for an hour and celebrate your life. So here's the good things ahead for you and your family. And thanks so much for joining us on the SuperPerformers podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Listening back to the SuperPerformers episode with Dr. Jordan Bonomo, I found so many impactful and fascinating takeaways. Some summary show notes I wanted to share from the podcast. We started with the calling of medicine for Jordan at an early age and why he chose emergency medicine. He mentioned having ADD and how the adrenaline of the specialty allowed him to hyper-concentrate for bursts of time and being an effective emergency medicine physician. I learned a fair bit about the treatment wall between emergency medicine and the ICU and how integrating the two is still a relatively recent phenomenon in the last 15 to 20 years. That really surprised me. Jordan was one of the first physicians in the world to train in this integrated discipline, and while it seems logical, his work there has been groundbreaking. Similarly, the Flex ICU that Jordan was integral in developing is changing the paradigm in terms of improving outcomes for individuals, creating a better, more efficient system. We're looking forward to seeing how that evolves. Jordan is generally all about breaking down silos and questioning why things are being done the way they are. asking if we can do better, which is certainly challenging in a healthcare delivery context. Jordan continues to make progress on this front. He talked about the pandemic, the first experiences of rationing care in the U.S., what kind of perspective it brought, and how difficult it was to practice medicine during that time while ultimately persevering. He was honest and sincere about mental health. Anxiety is part of the job. Confidence and resilience, yes, but some level of anxiety is healthy in high performance, whether you're a physician or in any other discipline. He talked about mission trips. All leave a mark and a measure of perspective on different cultures. There's resource constraints in those types of trips and in different cultures, leading to impossible life and death decisions. It's impactful work, but extremely difficult. The perspective leads to expressions of gratitude for our lives here in the U.S. and the access to healthcare we enjoy here. We delved into conversations about wellness, sleep, and nutrition. We've really focused on the nutrition piece and talking about common sense nutrition. In 15 years, Jordan's never eaten in the hospital cafeteria once, very disciplined. He talked about an exercise 20 minutes being better than nothing, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and the 80-20 rule, which I found comforting. If you're doing the right stuff 80% of the time, you're going to be okay. There are days to turn the knob to the left and relax, which he finds hard to do, but necessary. Important lessons to live by. We talked about owning and running a CrossFit gym and doing things the way he wants to do them in that regard, focusing on proper movement and the importance of movement patterns for longevity. He went from being a skinny vegan to a meat-loving CrossFit devotee and has learned a lot along the way with the CrossFit community. Speaking of community, he talked a lot about importance of community in our lives, whether it be in a gym, in faith, or whatever you do, and how that leads to enhanced longevity and overall happiness. He talked about a men's mental health group, keeping men safe at the gym. In general, he talked about suicide-proofing the gym and the importance the gym brings to him. He talked about how you can cry safely over a barbell and how healthy that will be. In the future, Jordan is front-side focused. As always, there's more to do. He's working on a medical analytics AI startup for preventative care. We're excited to see what Jordan Bonomo does next. Thanks again for joining us on the SuperPerformers podcast today, powered by 4100 FS. I hope you not only enjoyed listening, but you found the insights thought-provoking and relevant. We'll be back soon with another episode of SuperPerformers, Insights from the Driven. This is Rob Herman. Bye for now.